brand is, what's your meaning system? What is your why? What's your purpose? Why are you here and in service to what?
On this episode of Executive Edge, Simon is joined by Americus Reed, an expert in media and marketing.
Brand is an asset, just like anything else. It's something you have to nurture and care for and create.
Americus's primary research and consulting areas are in brand equity and identity loyalty.
How much do you need to talk to brand VPs and CMOs about the importance of understanding psychology in kind of making improvements to the brands in your advisory work?
Americus discusses personal as well as company identity and branding, providing insights into how psychology impacts brand perception and the importance of data-driven based decision-making in marketing and brand loyalty.
You have a brand whether you like it or not, and that brand is going to be forming whether you like it or not. So the only question then, Simon, is, are you going to take agency over that?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Executive Edge, here with your other host, Simon Rycroft. Super excited. I know I say that a lot, but I truly am today, here with Professor Americus Reed. How are you, Americus?
I'm doing well, Simon. How are you doing?
Good. I think everyone, if they didn't know who you were or your background before I did the intro, will have just got a quick snippet into the fact that you are an expert in media and marketing. So let me give the spiel because I think it's great context. But Professor Americus Reed II was the Whitney M. Young Jr. Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, where he's served on faculty since the year 2000. He's an avid fitness enthusiast, and I think we'll probably cover a bit of that as well today. Part-time drummer, which is also impressive, but looks like a full-time band member if you've ever seen him play. Tireless educator, truly. Americus's primary research and consulting area is in brand equity and identity loyalty. 2005, his academic work in this area received an honorable mention for the prestigious Robert Thurber Award for Academic Impact in the Journal of Consumer Research. 2009, he received the Journal of Consumer Research's Best Paper Award. Americus is also a recipient of the Society for Consumer Psychology 2023 Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. We're going to go into a little bit of the crossover and intersection and influence between psychology and marketing and kind of data analytics, which I think is fascinating later. His article, Identity-Based Consumer Behavior, was the recipient of the 2023 Steenkamp Long-Term Impact Award in the International Journal of Research and Marketing. So a ton of awards, which is great. When he isn't teaching, drumming, working out for 2 hours every day, teaching specifically on customer analysis, branding, and consumer psychology to undergraduates, graduates, doctorals, executive students. Americus has also been featured on TEDx, CNN, CNBC, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, New York Times, NPR, Time, The Hidden Brain podcast, and Knowledge at Wharton, and now Executive Edge. Hopefully that did you justice. I'm not sure that it did, but I think people will learn more as we get into the conversation. So thank you again.
I appreciate it, Simon. Really excited.
I don't think I know the full backstory. I know when we've chatted before, you have given me some insight. I mean, you've been an entrepreneur, an academic, and a brand enthusiast. I'd love to learn what kind of took you in the direction of brand and identity loyalty, because it's kind of unique, I think, and something that's super relevant for every company or anyone that's out marketing themselves as an individual. But I'd love to hear the backstory there if you could share it with us.
Oh, of course, Simon. I love that question. And, my story is a journey, really, because a long time ago in high school, I learned that one of the important fundamental psychological components of being a human is to figure out, who am I and how do I fit in? And so this was a big question in high school. Do I go with, am I more affiliated with the nerds or the jocks or the band? There were all of these groups that existed that were really salient in high school. And it brought to mind for me this deeper philosophical question of two things. One is, who am I and how do I fit in and why? And so that was a question that was always on my mind constantly. And so later on, as I was figuring out my academic role and the things that I was interested in terms of studying and learning, this question became a sort of question that I wanted to study and really try to understand at a much deeper level. So when I actually showed up in 1995 at the University of Florida in Gainesville to do a PhD in social psychology, consumer psychology in the marketing department in the Warrington College of Business, this was what I wanted to study. And in fact, my very first conversation with my advisor was telling him in a very declarative way, I want to study identity. Now, it was interesting, Simon, because he pushed back and he said, are you sure you want to study this? This is 1995. And at that time, the internet was sort of coming on board. So all of my colleagues in the PhD program, they were going to do an e-dissertation, like figure out, okay, the internet, how does the internet change pricing? How does the internet change, you name it? And for me, this question of identity, self-expression, who am I? How do I navigate a social environment to think about my own self-awareness, to grow as a person, to answer fundamental questions that are associated with my own personal development, and the role that brands, products, and services and organizations play in helping me affirm aspects about who I am. So for me, Simon, the question of identity is something that was so fascinating and important to me because, and I'll pose this for your listeners of the podcast, I challenge you to come up with a behavior, an activity that you can engage in as a person or as a consumer that somehow does not have some kind of implication about communicating something about who you are or who you want to be, either to some audience or yourself. And so because this thing of constructing a sense of self-expression and identity is so ubiquitous in engaging as a human member of the species, it's something that just has brought me to wanting to really study this in a much more rigorous way. And that's really led to my work that is, as you said, Simon, the crossover, if you will, between kind of psychology and marketing and brand.
Yeah, I love that. I think, and there's so much to unpack as well. The layers in there, I think there are more layers than I used to appreciate, right? There's more layers that people who generally work in marketing likely believe. And there's a lot of depth as well in the implications for all of us as individuals, which we normally put aside. I've gone down a complete rabbit hole. I've mentioned this, I think, on a previous podcast, researching a lot into Carl Jung. The study of one's own identity, he laid out in a particular framework. But it really hasn't been until the onset of people sharing more about who they are and then using, and then online tools that expose the good, the bad, and the ugly around corporate brands as well as individual brands. That it's become as people have become as aware. Previously it was the psychoanalyst, right, that you might have worked with, or maybe self-reflection or a bit of both would have helped you challenge, like, am I who I want to be? And and he built a path. He said that everyone should go through this process, and typically you get to certain stages when you're midlife, right, 40 to in your 50s, and that's when you start questioning things. And now people are a lot more open to following that journey and trying to search for their own Indiana Jones's kind of holy grail of what is that identity that I want to be that's going to get me all of the the jewels and the rewards in the world. But what you do is not just reflect on that, but also say, well, what does that mean for a company, and what actually is a company as a brand? And once you understand it and all the layers that influence it, how can you then work to, I guess, improve it? How much do you need to talk to brands, VPs and CMOs about the importance of understanding psychology in kind of making improvements to the brands in your advisory work?
In the advisory work, Simon, it is quite interesting because, I have different audiences.
Yeah.
And just like you said, when I talk to someone who is trained as, let's say, a chief marketing officer, much of what I say is kind of a singing to the choir, if you will, in the sense that I don't have to convince them of the underlying premises that drive this understanding of the interface between psychology and marketing. It's other areas where, and I can give you an example of this. I was having a conversation with an ops person, and I was explaining this idea, like this consumer that's out there. You have an opportunity, and this is exactly what you said, Simon. You have an opportunity to create a meaning system which is your brand, an identity around your brand, that if you do it right, it can synchronize with how this end consumer wants to see themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that synchronization creates a kind of connection and relationship between the individual consumer and that product, brand, service, or even company. And that's a beautiful thing when those two things fuse. And I was explaining this to a person kind of trained in ops. And I've had the same reaction when I talk to people who are trained in finance and trained in other areas. They just don't think about it in this sort of way. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that what you said, which is absolutely critical to this, which is your brand is an asset, just like anything else. It's something you have to nurture and care for and create and pay attention to, because it's the connective tissue in many cases that allows you to be perceived as different from other things that are competitive offerings that someone might choose. And so in many times, what we find is that the functional stuff of, okay, what does the mousetrap do, is certainly a utilitarian kind of understanding of something's features, right? Are the quality of the features good? But what brand does is brand actually, especially if you get the synchronization of self-concept and brand, you get this idea that now the person sees you through these rosy colored lenses. In other words, they're looking for ways to facilitate and to nurture and keep going this relationship they have with you, because it's semiotic. It's very connective. It's very related to self-awareness and
Mm-hmm.
affirming to them. If you're eating Ben and Jerry's, we could talk about the Ben and Jerry's example, some interesting things going on there
Mm-hmm.
right now. And there are values in there with the ice cream, in addition to the sugar and the cream and the milk. Then that means literally that if I'm consuming the ice cream, I'm not just consuming the ice cream, I'm affirming some part of, let's say, social impact in that case,
Mm-hmm.
that allows me to feel something different about an aspirational aspect of what it is that I would like to stand for myself. And so that's a beautiful thing. And CMOs get it because they come from that background. I have more of a challenge explaining it to folks who aren't trained in that, because here's the problem, Simon. They quickly think marketing is, oh, that's doing an ad.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand necessarily that marketing is a strategic approach, and branding is one very important piece of the strategic approach to create value.
And identity loyalty within the brand obviously has multiple layers to it. It's very relevant for CMOs.
Big time.
What about the brand identity of execs as individuals? I mean, this
Love
is I've
Yeah.
seen I've seen companies suddenly figure this out, or they stop advertising the name of the company and they start actually advertising and giving more exposure to the execs. And some companies really leverage that externally,
Mhm.
which I think is one side to the story. The other side is also, how do you leverage that internally? Like,
Yes.
who are you as an individual? How do you want to
100%.
inspire people? Because we have a lot of operations executives, chief supply chain officers, procurement leaders, CFOs,
Mhm.
where identity and brand of who they are as an individual is just a title, right? There's no time they're spending on that. Maybe they appreciate that there's some leverage they can get from playing the political game, right? And kind of being careful on how what they say can be perceived.
Yes.
But I don't see many execs at that level actually considering that they need to work on their own identity, consider that it's a brand in its own right, externally and internally, and then work on it. So how many execs outside of the CMO field are coming to you and being like, Americus, help us, tell us how other people actually perceive me, like give me the real insight, and then tell me how to improve it, because I'm now a believer that it could actually help me in my career, it could help the company, the shareholders beyond.
I love that point, Simon. It's really critical. I'll give you an interesting data point in this. This year, in 2025, I've done 5 executive training sessions with different groups on this specific issue. Okay, I've talked to a group of lawyers. I've talked to a group of female C-suite leaders as part of a networking organization in that domain, and others as well. And I believe that is telling me that the world is waking up to a kind of reality that I knew, and that you probably also know as well, Simon. And that is the idea that your brand. So first of all, let's step back a little bit, talk about brand. So what is brand? Brand is not logos and taglines and ads and aesthetic colors on website. Brand is, what's your meaning system? What is your why, to use Simon Sinekian terminology? What's your purpose? Why are you here, and in service to what? And so this meaning system then, it is going to be perceived whether or not you take agency over it. So anytime Simon or Americus engages with an audience, whether it be my students, whether it be your colleagues, other executives that you are helping to train through the Executive Edge podcast, no matter who it is, your children, loved ones, family, all of these things, when you interact, they form a sense of, what is this person's meaning system? What does America stand for? So the idea that I have a brand is not the right question. You have a brand whether you like it or not. And that brand is going to be forming whether you like it or not. So the only question then, Simon, this is what I told these groups that I have talked to this year in the personal branding domain is, are you going to take agency over that to create your personal brand as an authentic way to facilitate leadership? So it's not being fake. That's not what we're talking about. We're saying, you said it. We're saying use Jungian analysis, use psychology to go inside and to understand who you are and in service to what your values, your belief systems, all of these different aspects, and surface those things, bring them to the forefront and create your own meaning system that is your personal brand that you can then leverage to help you persuade, to be a good leader, to be consistent, to have discipline around the things that you consistently do and say. And that's huge. That's absolutely huge in terms of personal branding of C-suite people. You're going to have to basically do it, essentially. And so that's been the point that I've been trying. That's the big aha moment in these sessions that I have. And the big challenge is that if you're not paying attention to it, you can run into serious problems. And I think perhaps this year, the biggest example of that is our good friend Elon Musk, who didn't realize that Tesla had a brand, and he was a big part of that brand in the sense of people identified with his vision. And they're not just buying the electric car, they're sort of buying a little bit of that vision that he spent so much time making himself a part of. So he was surprised when he decided to align himself with Make America Great Again. He was surprised that people were upset. And it's like, it had to happen because you didn't understand that your previous brand of your company, which is so tied to you, had nothing to do with this other sort of more right-wing, let's say, conservative ideology associated with President Trump. And so like the question of personal brand is there. And if you fail to recognize how your personal brand might be tying into certain things that you're doing as a C-suite leader, as a person running a company, as an entrepreneur, you can run into big problems like this. So my point is, personal brand, pay attention to it and learn how to unearth these different sorts of analyses of self-awareness to help you become a better human. And in addition, to help you actually become a better leader.
Yeah. And I think maybe the hardest part is acknowledgement that you may have areas that you need to improve. No one wants to admit that, right?
Yes.
Especially if you've spent the best part of, 20, 30 years, working hard, playing the political game, and getting to that level. You're like, I've kind of already done this. I've earned this position. People now need to just follow me because I have that title.
Yes.
It's challenging that, saying, while that may have helped you get where you have now, how do you maintain that, and then how do you take the next step?
100%.
And it isn't just by staying the same person. It could be needing to change who you are because the people that are working for you, the global environment is adjusting. Right. New generations are coming into the workplace that perhaps weren't around, you didn't have to influence previously, that might need a slightly different approach to your direction. And I think that admitting that you may need to potentially change is step number one, right? But the fact that it's a meaning framework that's connected to you as an individual. There was one thing, and then I'll get your thoughts on this, that I read, a scientific study actually that highlighted and kind of proved that no one individual has the same experience than anyone else in the exact same environment. So
Yes.
you and I leave this podcast, right? And
Yes. Yes.
we're all running a simulation in our own brain. We do live in a simulation; it's just in our own heads, right?
Yes. Yes.
If you take that Matrix concept, and
Yes.
and we're going to have different perspectives, and they don't need to be
100%.
completely, tangential. Where I think the podcast was terrible. You walk away being like, "That's the best thing I've done for a couple of weeks." But there'll be little tweaks, right? Things that you notice that I don't, that you care about, that I don't focus on. So if you put that into a corporate realm, every time you send out an email, right, how you want it to be perceived, isn't always the way that it will by every single recipient. The same when you're giving a talk, the same when you're setting a strategy, you're giving a board presentation, you're talking to broader shareholders if it's a public company. That for me is an important thing to reflect on. So understanding that you as an individual and your brand and your meaning framework, I love that way to view it, is has an implication in everything you do. To me, it's just like lights on, right?
Yes.
You can use this to really make a difference in the way that the company grows, not just as you as an individual.
Yes.
What about the data side? That's one thing, when you gave us your first class and you were opening up, that always shocks people, right? I think at least, is the scientific and the analytic depth in which you go to. And I know that's been a lot of your background, but you're merging, the softer skills, but then also the psychology element with the scientific, prove it, right? And then use the scientific methodology to test new concepts out. And Jung did this, with physics Nobel Prize winner Pauly. So, what drove you to ensure that you were always doing your research with in-depth analytics and data proven points? Has it always been there?
Yeah.
You've always been a math nerd, or is it something incorporated kind of later on?
Yeah, I mean, math nerd. I don't know if I'm ready to take on that identity yet, Simon, but it was interesting because as a musician, you mentioned this earlier when you were introducing me to listeners of the podcast. I am a musician and a drummer. And so I have a knack in my mind for seeing patterns. So I didn't realize this until later on in my early part of my academic career. And it was super interesting to find that synchronicity between the way my brain kind of works, the way I express creativity in music, and statistical probability analyses and quantitative sorts of methods. Those things are highly related in terms of my sort of the way that my mind works. And I didn't realize this until much later. And it was over time, Simon, and I think this is very important for listeners of the Executive Edge podcast here. There's a big difference between data and insight. Let's start with that. And the idea being that insight is much more critical with respect to taking a bunch of information and figuring out what's the most important thing I need to focus in on and telling me what to do as an action step forward. And for me, what I loved about, I'm going to tell you this just real truthfully, Simon, what I loved about doing a PhD was the idea of being trained to think through, and this is actually very much related to really good executive leadership, strategy leadership, because you made the point that the self can be like involved, right? We can be rendering different subjective experiences of the same objective reality if we're not aware of that big aha moment that you pointed out so articulate. But for me, what helps mitigate disconnect between what I might perceive and what Simon might perceive is this really leaning in on this scientific method, which is meant to be, I pull myself out of this and I'm looking at information. I'm trying to get from data to insight. And for me, I love the scientific process because in the paradigm of the scientific process, the idea is truth is the preponderance of evidence over time for hypothesis that you have, and how strong is that evidence in terms of what we know at that particular moment in time. And so I love that idea, which is to say that is really the question of looking at information and not being persuaded by one particular data point or one anecdata piece of information, but looking across the totality and trying to understand what is this more or less pointing to as a likelihood of something that I can believe is true. And so that is a completely different way of thinking, because it forces you, Simon, to always be ready to let go of your prior beliefs if new strong data comes in, and that allows you to have this flexibility of mind. I remember this quote that someone once said: "Hold on to your ideas lightly." Mm-hmm. And this notion that be prepared. It's okay. Don't invest yourself into these ideas, because you need to be able to understand I can pull back. And and as a scientist, Simon, I'm prepared to be wrong, and I'm completely okay with that. And so data allows me to think in a certain way. If someone comes and tells me something, I'm not going to immediately believe it. I'm going to ask for information. Well, why do you want to do this particular strategic move, CFO colleague or CMO colleague, et cetera? Why do you want to do this? Or why is this particular public policy approach desirable? Let's look at data and make your argument, and then I can assess that. So I love that attempt. And it's hard to do this because humans, we're emotional creatures, but pulling yourself out and like trying to be objective about things. And more importantly, because we're going to get it wrong sometimes, but more importantly, to your point, having that aha moment that says, okay, I am a human and I can perceive things quite differently. Just that self-knowledge makes you a better decision maker, because you're aware that there may be instances where you're doing something that is going to perhaps be perceived quite differently from the perspective of some other audience. And so I love that point, and I love the notion of the PhD in scientific training being a sort of linchpin of creating an approach that allows me, to the best of my ability, and I'm not going to be perfect at it all the time, but to the best of my ability, objectively look at things. And what does the data say? Data doesn't care about your feelings. What does the data say? Let's go to it. Let's take a look at it. Let's not editorialize it. Let's just take it in its totality and try to understand it. So, and I think that's a very important piece with respect to a kind of key insight as to the interface of psychology and data, but also getting back to this leadership question, which is to say, as a great leader, it's on you to basically make sure you bring that kind of self-awareness to the decision-making process when you're engaging with others who may be affected by your actions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's two, so I mean, you could call them somewhat contradictory elements that just exist in the world. The first one is, academics, or at least let's split it into two. So education. When you're a kid, you spend the first, I want to say 15, maybe 18 years of your life assuming that science is fact, rather than the fact that it's just the latest facts that have been proven, using scientific methodology or math, but that it's actually constantly evolving. So that's one thing that part of the reason Jung talks about the importance of coming to these realizations at midlife, because you have to go through that earlier stage, almost training and education in order to be able to reflect back on it. Because if you haven't had that, how do you reflect on change? The second part is educational institutions getting a bad rep. Every ecosystem in society gets a bad rep, one year versus another. But it's important to reflect back on how critical those ecosystems are. From a competitive standpoint, we need to continue to have the best thinkers in a learning and scientific environment, constantly churning out new challenges to each other, new ways of thinking around the world. As soon as we start slowing that down, we start, evolving. So I just, the scientific approaches that you and a lot of your colleagues take, it's just, I don't think I'd appreciated up until the last few years how important they were. And I could just read scientific papers every minute of every hour of every day. I had the time. I'm just like, what were they thinking? Why did they come up with this? What is the counter argument? And it's energizing, to be honest with you. And I think Aristotle would be super proud of you because of the way that you have, from an orator award perspective, right? Like you have the ethos, you have the pathos, and you have the logos, and pretty much everything that you do, like the full package, right? And there's a lot of people in academia that they kind of have the logos side, right, and then they have the pathos from the title, but you bring the emotional appeal and counter views of ways to look at things, and that's why I think the
100%.
corporate world appreciate that perspective, because they need to see those three elements in order to be able to leverage it and know how to use it
Yeah.
outside of academia.
I love that point. I'm going to jump back to something you mentioned earlier, which sparked a thought in my mind, Simon. And that it's the challenge of, and this is very much in the Jungian tradition, but this notion that we spend a big part of our lives adapting to things, right? Asking and answering the question, what do my peers expect of me? What do my parents expect of me? What do my employers expect of me? All of these different things. What does my own personal family, loved ones, children even expect of me? And later on in life, those questions change to deeper questions around, because at the end of the day, we're not meant to be just ongoing creatures of adaptation. At some point, we reach a kind of higher level and start asking different questions, such as, who am I? And like, now, what is it that my soul seeks to express through me? And I've been going down this rabbit hole a little bit as well as you, Simon, just sort of confronting that very important question. Why am I here, and in service to what? And so it only happens later on in the perhaps loosely defined second half of our lives where we start really, hopefully, confronting that sort of a question. And it's that question, like you said, that I think opens up the aperture of how one might engage with others in the context of deeper analyses of self-awareness. And so I'm not going to stand here and pretend that Maslow is wrong, in the sense that, yes, you have to, the lower level needs. I mean, if you're trying to buy eggs and pay your rent and your cell phone bill, you're less likely to be at this higher sort of level of self-actualized question asking and self-awareness. Yes. But at some point, we start having to ask this particular type of question, especially later on in life, because it does open up a lot of different things. And one of the things that I think is important is that I've learned, which is shocking to me in some senses, which is the idea, like, where does meaning come from? And I've learned now, Simon, that it doesn't come from money. You can make lots of money, and yes, you should add value to the marketplace. But the true sense of meaning in the context of kind of a Jungian framework is to be on this journey of confronting these deeper questions, bigger questions. And the whole point being that if you ask bigger questions, you get a bigger life. And so this is where my focus is, probably just like you, Simon. I'm trying to take my mind towards that mental place and share this with other people, especially younger people, because I want to help them get in the time machine and get to these aha moments, like you were mentioning, Simon, faster and sooner rather than later. So that's a big part of thinking about all of this is, having that, being in touch with that inner dialogue, that voice, where you're trying to understand more about, and you said it, figuring out what are the things that energize me? Like just that question alone, and challenging your podcast listeners. Think about that. When you engage in, there are the litany of behaviors you can engage in. Some of them will energize you, just like you said. Others will drain you. Now, that's a signal of something, right? And so this notion of like paying attention to those signals to try to get to a more optimized place in your life and create more of that internal meaning for yourself and the people around you who are in your orbit and your loved ones is a massive goal with respect to the types of things that I'm interested in understanding. And again, this is part of the conversation around personal brand. Who am I? My meaning system, what's important, what energizes me? What does my soul seek to express through me? These are the questions that help people move toward a direction of really tapping into that kinetic energy that can really help them create a lot of meaning in their life, which then, by definition of this authentic creation and understanding and nurturance and articulation of self, allows me, Americus, to better interact with Simon, because I have a better sense of awareness about who I am and what I stand for. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's why, we could say that if you look back and reflect on it for you, I think that's why as an individual, whether you did it intentionally or not, you went down the brand and identity path, right?
Yes.
Because the
Yes.
universe is telling you we need Americus and America's energy to connect the dots.
Yes.
The brand and identity, I think the real winning formula where I've seen it work, and when you've done talks, right, to the media and in changes of brands and logos and the impacts of, C-level, actions on how the brand is perceived by the consumer. The missing part to me that you teach on is that, is that internal view, and you know is there research, I guess, then is there the next question, is there research that highlights, or is it formulating that the best leaders out there are ones who are self-reflective,
Yes.
authentic, who have gone through this process? And there is a term for it. Logotherapy is
Huh?
basically the study of the therapy-based study,
Interesting.
looking for the meaning of life and
Yes.
purpose. And it was Frankel. I remember his first name, but Frankel, that came up with this in the, I want to say it was the late 40s or 50s. And his whole practice was built on helping people who are searching for the meaning of life, with certain slightly different psychoanalytical techniques than, the Jungians out there. But yeah, back to this question. Is there studies
Yes.
on this that leaders who follow
100%.
are more reflective or more effective?
Yeah, that there's a large literature. Now, I'm not just, in full transparency, I'm not an organizational psychologist,
Yeah, yeah.
organizational behavior, although that was my master's degree at Georgia State University. Because I am fascinated because it's humans. It's humans inside of a company.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's going to happen when you put humans in a company? So there's, like you said, there's a lot of psychology there. I think it's very well understood that some of the greatest leaders have those qualities: empathy.
Mm-hmm.
They're able, self-awareness, emotional intelligence is a term that gets used a lot. The idea that they are able to make themselves vulnerable. So it's like this, Simon. It's like the analysis is like, let's think about what makes you a really good friend or a really good partner in any relationship, whether it be romantic or otherwise, family, whatever. Well, it's these same qualities,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's the ability to listen. It's the listen and not to be quiet, but to listen, which is very different from hearing, right? And so these sorts of qualities that you point to, well established that the best leaders are those leaders that empathy, emotional intelligence, vulnerability, self-awareness, the ability to step back and say, I want Simon to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if I have a team around me and I pour my energy into this team to be successful so that they can be successful, then they won't let me fail. So it's like there's this powerful concept that's there that says, I'm going to step back and make it less about me, make it more about others through these various mechanisms, these terms that I've thrown out there. And as a leader, that comes back to you. It's like, and I don't want to start sounding like, tin hat guy, but it is sort of this, the universe gives that back to you. So whatever you're putting out there, the universe is going to return it to you. And so it's definitely well understood that it's not the sort of hard hitting, very forward, aggressive. No, it's not that. It's actually in the long term. It's actually in the long term, it's these other sorts of qualities that would lead one to having a really great relationship in any domain, with the point being that that great relationship will play out in the corporate environment in the exact same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And if I put it into some context for some of the listeners, this applies not just to leadership with your team, or if you're an outward facing exec, right, that spends a lot of time talking to the public, talking to shareholders, investors, consumer facing, or ones that have to consider consumer influences in the work that the company or the brand is doing. This applies to supply chain officers. This applies. I mean, this definitely applies to procurement. And when I've trained and coached on negotiations, whether it's for large M&A transactions or large buying contracts, the customer that spends the most amount of money is not number one when it comes to the service, the reaction that they might get, the insight into innovation, the stock that's held on their behalf, the investment that's made. And then the number two is not number two, number three is not number three. Now, sometimes there's alignment, right? You're the biggest company like a Walmart or, Coca-Cola company out there, you're going to get the best deal from mid-sized suppliers. A lot of the times it's people to people. Right. So who is that chief procurement officer? Who is that chief supply chain officer? And, if they resonate well, the brand that they project out to their whole supply chain globally can have an influence on how effective they can be. 100%. So it has that outward external influence, right, to the energy in ways that are important. We think about the supply chain disruption as a result of COVID, the impact and some of the tariffs being passed down as costs to certain customers and not to others, the shifting of reshoring and moving supply chains closer, like which execs kind of got the edge and access to that stock first versus others.
Yep.
A lot of it was down to the individual. So, it's important to see that. And I think about it more as kind of magnetism to some extent that connects the energy out there. And, Jung says it's, there's the outward self that we reflect and we want other people. Then there's our inner consciousness, right? Which is, has all the other influences of who we are. And then there is this connective layer, which is when he starts getting a little kind of touchy-feely towards the end of his life and starts talking about, he came up with the phrase manifestation, right? That was based on his original research.
Yes.
And there's some ways that can be applied in a corporate setting as well.
I just want to build on that point a little bit.
Yeah.
I love this point because I get asked all the time. I bring up brands and brand meaning and all of these things, and people always say, well, it works, kind of in a narrow context, brands that are consumer facing brands, let's say, consumer packaged goods brands.
Yeah.
Everything we talked about today, Simon, everything applies to a business to business setting, applies to your relationship with your mom, applies to anything that involves connecting with humans and creating a way to relate to them, to develop a sense of affiliation and connective tissue again that allows you to thrive with them in this relationship. So wherever that's applicable, the concepts that we talked about today are highly relevant. And so one should not get caught up in the notion of, well, this B2B or is it supply chain? Does it work for this or this? It will work because you are human. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of this approach by Jung and others, is that analyzing the human psychology, going there and letting that be the fulcrum by which you build out a lot of understanding and awareness around those processes that are internal that then affect how you engage with the social world around you, unlocks all of these hacks, let's say, that allow you to be able to create those types of relationships across a wide swath of different settings.
So what's next for Americus? We heard a little bit of the backstory. I know there's probably more layers to that, but where's your studies or kind of research coming up taking you that readers should kind of keep an eye out for in the future?
Yeah, I'm doing still. Obviously, it's funny, Simon. I told my doctoral advisor in 1995, I was very adamant that I wanted to study this. And what I've learned is every time I do a research paper, and I've done a lot of research papers a quarter century into this effort, is I'll ask a question and try to answer it. I come up with a tentative answer to that particular question, but now I have 5 new questions. And so this has been like exponentially happening as I've continued along this career. And I've come to the realization that I'm not going to be able to answer every possible question because I'm just don't have time to do it, but it's the journey that matters. So what I'm looking at more recently is, and the reason why I was spending so much time on personal brand is this year with training lots of different groups is I want to be able to help people. I want people to have a better life. And so, I want to study some of the aspects that allow them, for example, Simon, how do you thrive in the workplace? How do you more quickly come to a sense of, a calling, a sense of a purpose? How do you find that? And so the workplace identity and the professional identity, which is super important to me, Simon, because we spend a ton of time, we spend more time with our colleagues at work than we do perhaps our family members, certainly over a certain period of time in our lives. So I want to be able to help people in that situation become much more optimized. So we're doing a lot of work on, that question of calling. We're doing a lot of work on the question of doing versus being. In other words, I am a podcaster versus I podcast are two different things. And how do labels that we might take on or not take on allow us to enhance this internalization process that connects us to particular social category labels and then allows us to more effectively affirm the identities that we would like to pursue. So doing some work in that area. I also want to work with younger kids as well. I have a 14-year-old daughter about to turn 15 on December 20th of this year. And watching her, she just started ninth grade in high school. And I'm watching this whole process play out now through her eyes. So how do I help younger people find a sense of meaning, find a sense of connection, find those things that energize them as well? So we're doing some work with the Wharton Global Youth Program to understand how we can work with kids at a younger age, all these different things. But the common question that we're researching very, very rigorously here is this question of identity. How do we measure it? How do we map it out? How do we help people, to your point, Simon, get in touch with that inner dialogue and that inner voice sooner rather than later? And how do we help them get on a path to optimizing meaning in their life? So I kind of started out as a brand identity and all of this, brand strategy and things like that were business concepts. And I'm slowly shifting to more fundamental ways that I can help people, of which might be, housed in a domain of business, but might be more general as well in terms of fundamental human psychology, which is the basis for all of this, by the way. You made the point earlier in the podcast that what's the difference between marketing and psychology? Well, marketing is applied psychology. That's that's the difference. So, those two things live in the same ecosystem of understanding. And so I want to bring all of the research that we study in identity and self-expression and affirmation, self-worth and self-esteem, mental health, all of these different aspects to help people become better at what it is that they want to do in pursuing aspirations around the identities that they would like to pursue as their personal growth and process unfolds over the life course.
Amazing. That's the only way to respond to that. I think you're taking that torch and continuing. He spent his whole life, right, trying to understand himself, in going through his own analysis. Even resisted doing a biography until he was in his 80s. One of his students or his mentees persuaded him that he needed to share that outside of just going and giving talks to other psychoanalysts that were just waiting with bated breath for his next piece of advice. But you're carrying that torch into a corporate environment, which I think is important. And you could even consider that a lot of execs and aspiring execs as well are applied psychologists, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
if they think about it in that realm, it may change the way that they do things. It may change the way that they consider that they need to keep working on themselves, right? So if one of the best psychologists of our time, spent his whole life trying to analyze himself, knowing that the answers would never come, and he just needed to keep peeling away the layers in order to help the rest of the world, then we should all as individuals probably reflect on that, right? There isn't an answer. You don't suddenly get to it. But by trying and sharing what you find and helping other people along their own journey, you will just no doubt improve, right? So we didn't get to the fitness side, but I think there's obviously parallels with that, right? If you just suddenly get your physique or, lose the weight you want to and then suddenly stop, funnily enough, it doesn't just stay there. So
100%.
All right. Well, I've overrun, and I'm so respectful of your time, and I know you've got 1,000 other things going on. I knew I'd enjoy this call. I'm going to go back and listen to the podcast again. We'll probably just fast forward my parts, right, to get to yours. But it was an honor to have you on. I really appreciate the time, and look forward to chatting again.
Appreciate that. I really do. And listeners, Executive Edge podcasts. Yeah. Please pay attention to this young man. He's young. I'm telling you, he was in my class shining like a beacon of deep intellectual curiosity. And I've been excited to watch his personal journey and professional journey unfold over time as well. It's been a pleasure and an honor to sit down and talk to you as well, Simon. It's always a pleasure for me as a professor of marketing in Wharton when the student becomes the teacher. So I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
All right. Thank you, man. Appreciate it.